Dear students, welcome to the 10th online lecture of Money and Banking course, where we will cover main points related to the management of monetary policy. In this lecture, we will focus on the main aspects of managing monetary policy by outlining the main objectives and tools of central banks based on chapters 14 and 17. As usual, let's start the lecture by outlining the main learning outcomes of this lecture. And in this lecture, we will explain 4 points, which include listing the key objectives of monetary policy and the main functions of central bank. We will also discuss the 3 tools of monetary policy and explain the difference between expansionary and contractionary monetary policy. The first point of the lecture is the main objectives of monetary policy, where the overriding or the primary objective of this policy is to achieve price stability or keeping the inflation rate at low levels. Then central banks could also work in achieving the following objectives as long as they don't contradict with achieving the primary goal which is price stability. So, the other objectives that could be achieved by monetary authorities include high employment and output stability, enhancing economic growth, stability of financial markets, interest rate stability, and finally, the stability of foreign exchange markets. Well, the entity that is responsible for managing monetary policy is called the central bank, as we have explained earlier in this course, and the actions of central banks have direct and indirect impacts on our daily lives, as we have seen in chapter 1, since their actions affect the amount of credit and the amount of money and interest rates, which in turn affects our decisions whether to save more or to consume more, and also it affects the cost of borrowing, which affects the firm's decision whether to increase their investment or not, and which will be reflected in other macroeconomic variables such as employment and inflation. Now, second point of this lecture is the main functions of central banks, and here we can list them in the following. First, clearing checks. Second, issuing new currency. Third, withdraw damaged currency from circulation. Fourth, to oversee the banking system and to make discount loans to the banks, as we have seen earlier. Then, central banks should also work on evaluating proposed measures and application for banks to expand their activities, and they collect data on local business conditions. And finally, central banks use their staffs of professional economists to make research topics related to the management of monetary policy. The third point of the lecture is the main tools of monetary policy, where central banks usually use 3 tools of monetary policy to control the money supply and the interest rate. These tools are discount lending, open market operations, and reserve requirements. What is the meaning of each of them? Discount lending means that central bank provides discount loans to commercial bank which face a shortfall in reserves, as we have seen in chapter 10. Second type of tool is the open market operations, which means that central bank purchases or sells government securities in the open market, and this action of the central bank to sell or to purchase securities depends on the objective that the central bank tries to achieve, as we will see when we explain the difference between the 2 types of monetary policy, expansionary and contractionary monetary policy. Then, The third tool is the reserve requirement or the required reserve ratio, which is set by the central bank, which is defined as the regulation that for every dollar of checkable deposits available at the bank must keep a certain fraction or percentage as reserves in the central bank, as we have explained in chapter 10. As in the case of other tools, central bank increases or decreases the required reserve ratio to achieve its objectives, as we will see now. Now, let's explain or summarize the relationship between the objectives, tools, and targets of central banks. As we can see in the figure, central bank uses its three tools to achieve the targets, and when these targets are achieved, the final goals of monetary policy should be achieved. Thus, when central bank it changes any of its tools, which are open market operation, discount loans, and the changes in the reserve requirements, these changes will lead to changes in the targets of monetary policy, which are money supply or interest rate, and here we call them intermediate goals of central bank. So, as I said, when central bank it changes any of its tools, this will lead to a change in the intermediate targets, which include interest rates and money supply, and after that, these changes in both money supply and interest rate will lead to achieving the final objectives of monetary policy, which are listed here, as we will see in this lecture. Now, let's explain the difference between expansionary and contractionary monetary policy. First, expansionary monetary policy is used to overcome a recession or a depression, which means that we need to induce or enhance the aggregate demand by increasing consumption and investment. To do this, the central bank may apply one or more of the following procedures. First, decrease discount rate, which means that the cost of commercial banks to borrow from the central bank will be lower than before, and this procedure will encourage banks to make discount loans from the central bank. And in this case, commercial banks will decrease interest rate on the loans they lend to individuals and firms. So here, the amount of credit will increase and the money supply will increase. Thus, when commercial banks decreases interest rate, this will lead to enhancing investment, given that low interest rate represents low cost of borrowing. And of course, as we have seen in chapter 1, low interest rate will discourage saving. So here, people will consume more. So as we can see, this low interest rate will increase both consumption and investment, which will lead to an increase in the aggregate demand. Second tool of expansionary monetary policy is to purchase securities through the open market operations. And when central bank purchases securities from commercial banks, these banks will have more funds or more excess reserves that can be used to make loans. So they will extend their loans to both individuals and firms. And of course, this should result in increasing consumption and investment, which will lead to higher aggregate demand, as we have explained. The third tool of central bank is to decrease the required reserve ratio, which means that banks will have more excess reserves that can be used to increase loans, which will lead to higher aggregate demand, as we have just explained in the previous two tools. So all these procedures will lead to an increase in the aggregate demand. So now let's summarize what happens when we have an expansionary monetary policy. So in this case, central bank will follow one or more than of these procedures. it will decrease discount rate or purchases securities or lowers the reserve requirements. All these procedures will lead to a fall in the interest rate, which will lead to an increase in the money supply, and we will have an increase in investment and consumption, which will lead at the end to a higher level of aggregate demand. Now, let's explain the contractionary monetary policy or tight monetary policy, which will be applied to overcome inflation, which means that it's the opposite to the expansionary monetary policy. So now the central bank should apply these tools in the opposite way. This means that central bank should work at reducing aggregate demand by decreasing consumption and investment. To do this, central bank may apply one or more of the following procedures. Central bank may increase discount rate, and this means that the cost of commercial banks to borrow from the central bank will be higher than before, and this procedure will discourage banks to make discount loans from the central bank. So in this case, commercial banks will increase interest rate on the loans they lend to individuals and firms. So the amount of credit and the money supply will decrease. So based on that, we can say the increase in the interest rate will lead to a decline in investment given the high cost of borrowing, and at the same time, high interest rate will encourage people to save more. So in this case, they will reduce their level of consumption. Consequently, both consumption and investment will decrease, leading to a decline in the aggregate demand, which will lead to lowering inflation rate if we assume that the inflation is a demand pull inflation. Second tool of contractionary monetary policy is central bank should sell securities through the open market operations, and when central bank sells the securities to commercial banks, then these banks will have less funds or less excess reserves that can be used to make loans, so they will decrease loans to both individuals and firms. And of course, this will lead to lower consumption and investment, which will imply a decrease in aggregate demand, leading to low inflation rate. The final tool of the central bank is to increase the required reserve ratio, which means that now banks will have less excess reserves that can be used to make loans, so they will reduce the amount of credit and the aggregate demand will be lower than before, which will lead to a reduction in inflation rate. Based on that, we can say all these procedures will lead to a decline in the aggregate demand, and it should work at reducing inflation rate. So now let's summarize the impact of applying these tools. In case of inflation rate, central bank will apply one or more of these procedures or tools. It will increase discount rate, it will sell securities or increase the reserve requirements, and this should lead to a higher interest rate, which will in turn imply a decrease in the money supply, which will lead to lower investment and consumption, and this should lead to a decrease in the aggregate demand and a lower inflation rate. So this is the end of this lecture. Thank you for watching and see you in the campus.